Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining, or actually good afternoon, should I say. Thank you for joining us for our debate today on abortion, human rights, or human rights violation. Our two debaters are Professor Eike-Henner Kluge, who will be representing the pro-choice side of the debate, and Stephanie Gray, who will be representing the pro-life side. My name is Anastasia, and I'll be moderating the debate tonight. This event is an opportunity to hear both sides of the debate. We're here to respectfully listen to what both debaters will be saying, and I ask that you please respect the viewing experience of other people here as well. At the end of the debate, you will have an opportunity to ask any questions that you want from the debaters, and both of our debaters will be here after the debate to talk and answer any other questions you might have. I'm just going to share with you a little bit about the rules of the debate. The debate will start with opening statements from both of our speakers. This will be followed by a cross-examination period. Then both sides will have an opportunity for a rebuttal, and then conclude with their closing statements. During the cross-examination period, the participant asking the questions controls the time and may interrupt the opponent, and this isn't rude, this is just how the cross-examination period is done. And I would like to draw your attention to a survey some of you may have received when you arrived. We ask that you fill this out before you leave, and we do have more surveys coming that we can hand out at the end. So I'll just do a brief introduction to our two speakers. Dr. Kluge is a philosophy professor here at UVic, and he's also the departmental ombudsperson. He's taught at various universities in the US and Canada before coming to UVic. In 1989, he was asked by the Canadian Medical Association to establish the Department of Ethics and Legal Affairs, and was its first director. He was the first expert witness in medical ethics recognized by Canadian courts, and has acted in that capacity in Alberta, BC, and Ontario. He has been a consultant to Health Canada, various provincial ministries of health, and health regions. And in 2005, he received the Award of Research Excellence of the UVic Faculty of Humanities. And in 2007, he was awarded the Abbyman Lynch Medal for Bioethics by the Royal Society of Canada. His current research interests include medical informatics, human tissue banking, and genetic engineering. If you give me 1 second, I'll get my phone to get Stephanie's bio. Stephanie Gray. Stephanie has spent more than a dozen years mastering the art of conversation on abortion. As an international presenter, she has spoken in Costa Rica, Latvia, England, and the United States, and across Canada. She has formally debated abortion doctors and professors in debates at universities, and has had thousands of one-on-one conversations with people on abortion. Stephanie is the author of A Physician's Guide to Discussing Abortion, and is a faculty of Blackstone Legal Fellowship, training law students from around the world about controversies pertaining to abortion. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from UBC and a certification with distinction in Healthcare Ethics from NCBC in Philadelphia. She is with us today on behalf of the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. So we'll now go into our debate, starting first with Stephanie.
All right, well, today we're asked to consider whether abortion is a human right or a human rights violation. And in order to answer that question, I think we need to begin by asking ourselves, what are human rights and who gets them? And human rights are basically rights that an individual has because they are human. We could contrast that, for example, with women's rights. If someone has women's rights, that implies that they have to be a woman, and then they get the rights. Or if they have children's rights, it implies that they need to be a child, and then by virtue of being a child, they get the rights accorded to children. And so when it comes to human rights, the question simply is someone human? Then they get those rights inherent to being a human. If we look generally, before addressing the issue of abortion, if we look generally at human rights, across the world, civil societies have a standard of saying all humans have the right to life. And we see this, in fact, in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 7 says everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Now, what's significant here is it says everyone. There are elements of our charter that talk about rights that not everyone gets. There are certain rights in Canada that only citizens of Canada get. But when it comes to the right to life, our charter does not narrow that right and say only citizens get it, but rather everyone gets it. Then if we move ahead to section 15 of our charter, it says every individual, so not just citizens, every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. And then it lists the kinds of discrimination that would be problematic, including discriminating against someone based on age or physical disability. If we go more international in scope in looking at human rights doctrines, we have the United Nations, which has a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 3 says everyone has the right to life. Everyone. And within the document, it defines everyone as all members of the human family. So who gets the right to life? Members of the human family. Then if we move to another document, the United Nations also has the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. And in this document, it says the child, by reason of his or her physical and mental immaturities, has rights to special safeguards and care before as well as after birth, end quote. So the United Nations, in its Declaration on the Rights of the Child, is very clearly saying it's because the child is vulnerable, it's because the child is weak, it's because the child is needy that they get special rights, they get special safeguards, and by the way, those begin before birth. So then we could ask ourselves, well, at what point before birth do we have a child? Because if we can identify when each of our lives began, when a child comes to be, then it would logically follow from the point we have the child, the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms would all apply to that individual. So what I want to do in making my case today that abortion is a human rights violation is look at the facts of how the preborn child from fertilization onwards is a human being, and look at the facts about how abortion violates the right to life of that human being in order to come to the conclusion that abortion is a human rights violation. So we look at this document on the rights of the child that says the child has rights before birth. So when did the child come to be? When did each of us come to be? Well, there are three options for when we began our lives. Option number one would be before fertilization. Option number two would be at fertilization. And option number three would be sometime after fertilization. So let's explore each one of these categories to see which makes the most sense scientifically. If we look at option number one, when we have the sperm and the egg by themselves, although we can identify those as human, if from a human male or a human female, the reality is the sperm or the egg by themselves merely are human parts. And so we know that the sperm in a man's body by itself is not going to grow and develop into the young child. The eggs in a woman's body without any sperm in her body, those eggs are not going to grow and develop into the young child. So we have a potential human when we have sperm and egg, but we don't have an actual human. By themselves, they're merely human parts. So we rule out that first option as being the logical place, the scientific basis for us beginning our lives. Let's go to the other extreme. Let's consider that we began our lives sometime after birth. Let's take, for example, the young child pictured here. If a young child like her simply or suddenly walked into this room, it wouldn't be logical to conclude that she came into existence the moment she entered the room. Instead, we know that if a young child is before us, that she grew and matured from a younger version of herself, namely what we have pictured here, the infant. And yet if someone had an infant in their arms, we wouldn't conclude that that infant suddenly came to be spontaneously out of nowhere. You know, the story we maybe tell little children that babies come from storks that fly in the sky and have, you know, blankets in their beaks and drop babies on doorsteps. We may tell that story to children, but we know that that's not really true for where babies come from. That if we have an infant, the infant had to grow and mature from a younger version of herself, namely a fetus. But no woman wakes up one day with her abdomen out to here and a fetus in her uterus kicking rapidly. That for a woman to be, let's say, 8 months pregnant, for that fetus to be kicking in her womb, that fetus had to grow and mature from a younger version of herself, namely the one-cell embryo stage, also called a zygote. And so that brings me to that middle category. Scientifically, there's no debate biologically about when we began our lives. There's consensus amongst all the medical textbooks, such as Langman's embryology, Moore Persaud's embryology, which says human development is a continuum that begins at fertilization. Because before fertilization, we covered, we only have human parts. But at fertilization, those parts come together. We know that when the sperm and the egg come together, the genetic information which distinguishes this young child from all of us, that was determined. And from that point forward, there's simply a change in appearance and ability, but not the very nature of the individual. In order to look further at the moment of fertilization, let's consider for a moment what kind of being the zygote must be. If the parents are human, the pregnant woman is human, if her partner is human, the only thing species-wise for the embryo or that zygote to be is human. We also know that at fertilization, what we know to be human if the parents are human also must be alive at fertilization, because we know scientifically that living things come from other living things, and if something is growing, it's alive. So the one-cell embryo is growing into 2 cells, 4 cells, 8, and so forth. And so by virtue of that growth, we know the embryo is alive. By virtue of having human parents, we know the embryo is human. Now let's look at that one-celled embryo in contrast to the sperm cell or the egg cell. When scientists want to distinguish one cell type from another, to determine are they the same or are they different, they look at 2 criteria: cell composition and cell behavior. In other words, what is the cell made up of and what does it do? And if we can see that one cell differs from another cell based on that criteria, then we know we have a different kind of cell. So let's look at the makeup of a sperm cell. It's the genetic material of the man. The composition of the egg cell, the genetic material of the woman. But the moment one sperm fertilizes an egg, the one-celled embryo by composition is different. It now contains the genetic material of the mother and the father. Even before the chromosomes have intermingled, nonetheless, all the genetic material is there by composition. Then there's behavior. The behavior of a sperm cell is to find an egg and fertilize it. The behavior of an egg cell is to allow for fertilization. Now, if we look at this criteria of behavior, that's how we can see we have something substantively different at fertilization compared to before fertilization. The behavior of a one-celled embryo, if another sperm comes along and tries to fertilize it, is to prevent fertilization. So whereas a sperm cell will fertilize, an egg cell will allow for fertilization. The moment one sperm fertilizes an egg, if another sperm comes along to what is now a one-celled embryo or a zygote, the behavior of the zygote is to prevent a sperm from fertilizing it or penetrating it. And so therefore, by behavior, we know we're dealing with a different kind of cell. I think another way to wrap our minds around the idea that a young child pictured here began her life not as an infant, not as a sperm, but in that middle category, that of an embryo, is to consider an old technology, Polaroid cameras. I've got an old picture here, a Polaroid photo, where back in the day people had cameras that looked like printers, and they would take a photo and the little card would come out, and when the card came out, the person would not see the image that they just captured right away. They would see brown, black, smudgy stuff. And then what would they do as they look at the image? What's the behavior they would do? Shake it like a Polaroid picture, right? So they would shake it. And then within a few minutes, the image would appear. Well, imagine you go on vacation using your parents' trusty Polaroid camera as a way of documenting your trip. And let's imagine you go to where my dad is from. You go to Scotland. Okay, that's right, love the accents of the Scots. So anyways, let's say you go to Scotland, and while you're in Scotland, you go to Loch Ness. What's in Loch Ness? The monster. And my grandma couldn't see her hand in front of her face, but she swore out in the distance that she saw Nessie. So let's imagine you're on a tour of Loch Ness. You're using that Polaroid camera to take photos of all the scenery. And a couple hours into your boat tour on this lake, you look to your right and you see Nessie. All the humps and bumps are sticking out of the water, so you point your Polaroid in that direction. You snap a photo. The card comes out, and just as the card comes out, Nessie goes underwater. Now you might be upset she's disappeared, but what will alleviate your frustration that she's now gone is that you're holding in your hands evidence. Evidence that what people thought was a myth is reality. And you're looking at this Polaroid picture, and all it shows is black, brown, smudgy stuff, but you're shaking it thinking, I'm going to make money to pay off my student debt. I'm going to sell this to newspapers and magazines. Now let's say as you're doing this, a tourist on this boat with you has never seen this technology. Excitedly grabs the card from you to have a look at Nessie, but doesn't see Nessie, only sees the brown, black, smudgy stuff. And when she sees that, she thinks the photo didn't take properly. And so with great disappointment, she rips it and tosses it in the lake. Would you be upset? Right, I'll tell you, my Scottish temper would come out, right? A little bit of Braveheart would get out there. So imagine if in getting angry at this tourist for destroying your photo, the tourist said, it was just brown, black, smudgy stuff. What do you care about brown, black, smudgy stuff for? Now you'd likely reply, it wasn't just brown, black, smudgy stuff. Everything about that image of the Loch Ness Monster was captured in an instant. It just needed time to develop. So as we can see from this analogy, that something of value, such as an image of the Loch Ness Monster, comes to be in an instant, but needs time to develop. And so the same is true for each one of us. If we're humans with human rights right now, and we are, then who we are as humans came to be in an instant, but we just needed time to develop. And that instant was the instant of sperm-egg fusion. That was fertilization. Now, sometimes people will say, yes, but how can something the size of a period at the end of a sentence have the same human rights as you and me? And what we need to point out is that if we say the embryo doesn't have rights because she's smaller than us, then that wouldn't be human rights, that would be size rights. And clearly, the question is not how big or small is someone, but what is someone? Are they a member of the human family? And so we know the embryo is a member of the human family who began her biological existence at fertilization, and from that point forward needed time to develop. So yes, there was a change in size. But between a newborn and an adult, there's a difference in size. In fact, there's this great book called The Do's and Don'ts of Parenting, which shows through images what you should and shouldn't do with your children, which I think makes the point that our value shouldn't be grounded in our size. So this is one such example, as you can see here. Even with born children, there's certain things we can't do because of their size. It doesn't mean they're not human, it doesn't mean they don't have human rights. So the same is true with a preborn child in contrast to a born child. There is a difference in size. It doesn't mean the preborn child doesn't have human rights. Then there's a level of development difference. Physically and intellectually, yes, the embryo is less developed, but so is a newborn in contrast to the parents. So we see there are some children that can't play chess because of their lower level of development, but are they human? And do they have human rights, regardless of their level of development? Yes. So in the same way, because the fetus is human, the fetus has human rights, even if she's a lower level of development. And then there's the fact that the embryo or the fetus is in the mother's body in a different environment. Should we deprive the human of her human rights because of her environment? Well, we don't do that with born children. We recognize that some born children won't survive in certain environments. It doesn't mean we deprive them of human rights because of their inability to survive outside of one environment and into the next. So in the same way, the fetus will not survive outside of the uterus and in another environment, but it doesn't mean we deprive the fetus of her human rights because of that. And finally, there's dependency. The preborn child is more dependent than a born child, but so is a born child more dependent than an adult. And we see that even with these born children with different degrees of dependency, we don't say they're not human, and we don't deprive them of their human rights. So in the same way, I agree this preborn child is more dependent than the infant at the breast here. But it doesn't mean the preborn child is not human, and it doesn't mean the preborn child doesn't have human rights. In fact, we know the preborn child is human, and by that, they get human rights, because human rights imply you get the rights because you're human. And so, the only other thing we need to figure out is whether the act of abortion is a violation of the human right to live. And the position that I'm obviously taking is that yes, it does, because we know we're dealing with a human, we've seen images of that human, so the question is, what does abortion do to the human? Well, looking at the evidence of abortion procedures, this is one in the first trimester, we see the power of the suction tube is going to dismember the body of a tiny human. So we see the hands and the feet. And then there's late-term abortion, which is legal in Canada all the way up to birth. And once again, we see the dismemberment, the decapitation, the disembowelment of the body of a baby we know to be of the human species because the parents are human, and therefore by this evidence we know that abortion is a human rights violation. I'm going to make one more point about how abortion is destructive by looking more clearly at the evidence of abortion. Even at 7 weeks, we can see the child is human, and abortion violated that human's right to life. Thank you very much.
I'm a technological idiot, so we're going to have to transfer here some stuff before I can talk. Are you starting the timer already? In fact, I even have to start up my laptop. Sorry about this. My 18 minutes starts now. I am not nearly as eloquent as Stephanie. I'm going to start like a prof as usual, with slides that say things. So, the topic is, of course, abortion, human right, and violation of human rights. And this is, of course, based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says all members of the human family have certain rights. But the interesting thing is, it defines members of the human family as those endowed with reason and conscience. I'm going to do something with that in a minute. Hold on. These are rights. And everybody agrees that members of the human family have the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and equality under the law. So it's against the law to kill one person, and it's against the law to kill another person, at least according to the Universal Declaration. So I'm going to look at it both from the side of view of the fetus, as well as the side of the woman, both as a right, as a violation of human rights, and as, in fact, a right, a human right. Okay? So I'm going to start with the zygote, embryo, or fetus aside. So the issue, of course, is one has to ask, how is the notion of the member of a human family to be understood? And there are variations. One can understand it biologically, legally, or even some other way. So I'm going to look at these, because I think how you understand the term determines, in the end, whether your conclusion follows from your premises. Basic, boring logic. Okay? Understood biologically, member of this human species, of course, is understood, as Ms. Gray said, in terms of having a human genetic code. It says nothing, she's quite right, it says nothing about the development of the code. It also says nothing about whether the entity is alive or dead. Let's face it, a dead human being is still a human being. They just happen not to be alive. And ironically enough, totipotent stem cells, also equivalent to zygotes and therefore count as humans in that sense. What can you do with that? Well, we'll see. However, logically, if both women and zygotes and embryos have to be understood as human, then in fact both have the right to life. There's no question about that. The issue is, are they human in the relevant sense? So that doesn't necessarily mean that abortion will be a violation of human rights even if both are human, logically. It doesn't mean that. The issue of abortion then becomes the issue of whose rights take priority. Even if you give a zygote rights, the issue is how do you balance that right against the right of the woman? And balancing and somebody losing doesn't mean you violated the right of the individual who lost. That's simply how rights work, unfortunately. And a piece of advice for all of you, not everything that's tragic is unethical. And sometimes one has to make tragic choices. So stay tuned. So, I won't go through. On this understanding of the biological understanding, notice that cerebrally and whole-brain dead human beings are still human beings and therefore theoretically still have rights. So do anencephalics, babies who have no brain at all, but they're certainly human in the biological sense. And the ironic thing is, when we keep alive a cerebrally dead human being, in other words, no higher brain centers, the record is coma Elaine, as I told my students. 36.5 years. One can also keep a whole brain dead person alive. The record is roughly 28 days. There's no brain, the brain is liquefied, but it's certainly human, and certainly biologically alive. Okay? One can understand the term human being legally. Then, of course, Canadian law or other law applies. A child becomes a human being when it has proceeded completely in a living state from the body of its mother. Okay? Now, this is going to be problematic for those of you who are in biology. I've been doing a little work in Japan on artificial placentas and artificial uteruses. They will never have proceeded from the body of their mother, ever. And therefore, by this law, they will not be human. But that's on the side. Okay? It still follows, by the legal definition, that a woman will be as a human being, but a zygote or embryo in utero will not be a human being. So on that understanding, the answer to the initial question, whether it's a violation of rights, the answer is, no, it isn't, because it's not human. Not in that sense, but stay tuned. So, third definition of member of the human family. Okay? The Declaration defines members of the human family as those who are, quote, endowed with reason and conscience. The unfortunate or fortunate fact is that not all members of the species at all stages of their development have that capacity. Or are that? They don't satisfy that definition because reason or conscience require a body whose nervous system is developed to a certain stage. This is not something modern. This, believe it or not, goes back to the Middle Ages, 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas, when he says that abortion is not murder until the fetus has acquired a brain that is capable of self-awareness and understanding. Well, that's an aside, okay? So the capacity is attained only roughly 18 to 20 weeks. This was established already in the 1940s by Cajal, a very famous Spanish investigator on the neurological development of the fetus. The only thing that's present early then is a potential. And of course, not all human beings, in the biological sense, satisfy that, because anencephalics have no potential of reason and awareness and understanding. Neither do cerebrally dead human beings and all brain dead human beings who biologically are human, but according to the human rights definition are not human. Okay? But one can say, well, they have the potential. Okay? That's the famous argument from potentiality. A zygote has the potential to become a human being in the sense of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the argument then is that therefore it's a violation of the human right of the zygote. But as anyone who's taken logic 100, we call that baby logic technically, anyone who's taken baby logic knows that argument doesn't follow. Wait for it. Yeah. Oh, come on. I have no sense of humor. It was happening when I was 3 years old. Okay? There are 2 replies to this. The logical reply, and the logical reply is a potential X is not an actual X. As I keep telling my students, you're potential Nobel Prize winners, but that doesn't mean you are actual ones. You potential, yes, right? The fact that a right belongs to an actual X doesn't entail that it belongs to a potential X. That really needs a different argument. It needs a separate argument. Okay? At best, a potential X potentially has rights. That's a different story. And potentially having a right is not actually having a right. It just simply isn't. Therefore, the fact that a zygote, etc., is a potential human in the sense of the declaration does not entail that it has human rights. Its potentiality doesn't give it those rights. Very bad logic. You fail logic 100. Okay? Second meaning of potential is, potential has at least 3 different meanings. At least, I can actually give you more. Okay? Unlimited potential, what in principle is possible. A primordial interstellar gas cloud is potentially a tree or you. That's where your matter came from. But that doesn't mean an interstellar gas cloud is a person or is a human being. Kind-limited potential is, given the nature of the entity as a member of the species, it has certain potentials. An acorn, which by the way is a fetal oak, is a potential oak tree. But if I sued you for destroying my oak forest when your pigs ate my acorns, I would be laughed out of court. Oaks are not acorns and vice versa. They're different. Now there's something known as constitutive potential, where there's something possible for the entity to do without undergoing a fundamental change. And that's the way, for example, an oak can acquire certain leaves, number of leaves, whatever have you. You get the point? All right, good. Hey, I'm a prof, I'm boring. Okay. So, the declaration statement entails a human right for the fetus only if potential is understood in this third sense. In other words, it's got all the wherewithal, and now has to actualize that. Okay? So, it requires no development, and the fetus has the potential in that sense only roughly around 18 to 20 weeks. Okay? So abortion is a violation of human rights only if the fetus has passed this crucial stage of development. And interestingly enough, this is accepted by the Canadian Medical Association, the Canadian Pediatric Society, and it's perfectly in keeping with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It cannot be a violation of human rights before that. It simply cannot be, logically. So, Is it a violation of human rights? No. Is an abortion a human right? The flip side of the debate. I have 6.5 minutes, I better talk quickly. Okay, so all human beings, that of course includes women, have the right to security of the person. I don't know why I have to keep saying women. All persons have the right to security of the person. And sex is an accident. It may be a nice accident, but it's an accident. Hey, I can go chapter and verse on that one, okay? Therefore, of course, to deny a woman a right to an abortion because the fetus has reached the stage where it falls under the declaration, oh, pardon me, that the fetus has not reached that stage, okay, is to violate her rights. Because there's no right being violated. But that doesn't mean that the woman has a right to an abortion at every stage of fetal development. It doesn't mean that either. So if you expect me to come down on Miss Gray and say, well, I'm not going to, that's illogical. And I try to be logical. The right to evacuate a uterus is logically distinct from the right to evacuate and kill what's in it. They're two different things. You may not like it, but that's logic, that's fact. Okay? So it means that the right to an abortion is not the same as the right to kill the fetus. Therefore, abortion and killing the fetus is a woman's right only if at least one of these is true. The fetus has not reached the stage of critical development, or the fetus has reached that stage, but its rights are overbalanced. Okay? Now, it's interesting that the CMA defines an abortion as the active termination of pregnancy before viability. And this is agreed to by the Canadian Pediatric Society. Oh, by the way, for those of you who want to cite Roe versus Wade, please don't. That's US law. It doesn't apply in Canada. Okay? I can give you reasons why it doesn't apply, but that's another issue. Now, this is what I wanted to mention to you before. It's becoming a distinct possibility to keep a fetus alive after it's been removed. Okay? If you want data on that, and we've been working on that, yeah. Does this change the picture about abortion? Yeah, it may have logical implications after the fetus has reached a certain stage of development, but not before. Okay? So, the answer to the original initial question is twofold. Abortion is a human right before the fetus has reached the stage of neurological development that I talked about. It is a human rights violation after that stage. That's why the Canadian Pediatric Society says after 20 weeks, the physician has 2 patients. That's not anti-abortion, right to life, whatever. That is reality. Okay? So, it all depends on what the fetus is. Not where it is, but where it is in its development. If it hasn't got the brains, if it hasn't got the neurology, then it can't be a person. Because only person, even in the definition, International Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Declaration, must be capable of, without undergoing change, must be capable of reason, understanding, and volition. And when you haven't got the neurological development, you haven't got that. The fact that potentially you will have that means that you potentially have those rights, but potentially having rights is not having rights. Potentially, I have the right for you to fall down on your knees and kiss my feet because I've saved the world from absolutely everything. Potentially. It's not going to be likely. Okay? So one has to keep that in mind. Where is the fetus? How far is it developed? And if one interferes with a person's right to self-determination regarding a body, whether that's male or female, when there is no competing right of an actual right holder, that's a violation of security of the person. Of course, that means that a Canadian society that is going to be just is going to put into place medical services that allow abortions without problems in the early stages of pregnancy. Absolutely. It's to discriminate otherwise. But as the Supreme Court said in Morgenthaler, it will not strike down a law that makes it increasingly difficult to have an abortion in the later stages of pregnancy. That is within the powers of Parliament, and the Supreme Court says that is acceptable. A gradualistic law. There is no law. Right now, you can have an abortion at 9 months before you go into labor. I personally have video footage of a third trimester abortion. Here comes a head, there comes an arm, there comes the torso. Would that be a violation of human rights if the neurological development of the fetus has gone? Yes, it would be. And the Canadian Medical Society would be very upset. And so would the Canadian Pediatric Society. But that doesn't mean that a woman shouldn't or couldn't have had an abortion early on. That's a social issue. I have 30 seconds. I won't use them. Thank you.
We'll now have a cross-examination period where Stephanie will ask Professor Kluge questions.
It's not Professor Kluge. Is she Stephanie? I'm Ike.
You can keep that. I'll just ask.
You're going to ask me questions?
Yeah, and then you get to ask me.
Oh, okay.
Ike.
Do I get to stand up?
Do you want to? Okay, hold on. All right, so you are saying that an abortion at 8 months pregnancy would be a human rights violation, correct?
Yes.
And if I'm hearing you correct, the reason for that is because of the neurological development of the fetus.
Yes.
Okay, so why doesn't a one-celled embryo have a brain?
Because that simple biology, man, refer you back to human physiology and biology. You need the totipotent cells in the zygote to become pluripotent, and then, of course, to specialize in the different kinds of cells, which then, after the neuroplate has been laid down, will proliferate into brains, blah, blah.
Okay, so why hasn't that happened yet?
I don't know. I mean, it may not have happened because the woman took the fertilized ovum, which was, by the way, fertilized IVF, and put it into a freezer.
Correct, that's one possibility, but if the embryo was thawed and placed in her uterus, would we suddenly, for example, find a woman who has a 2-year pregnancy the way elephants do? Or would you agree that humans in our species have a 9-month gestational period and that the embryo doesn't have the brain and the neurological abilities you speak of the late-term fetus having, ultimately because of its age?
Not because of its age,
What's the reason
as such, but rather because the cellular differentiation doesn't take place.
And why hasn't it taken place?
Because there's not enough food, sometimes because there's not enough time, but it's not simply...
Not enough time? And what is time reflective of? Reflected in would you say time is reflected in our age?
Sure, why not?
Okay. Moving on to the next question. So you're saying that the CMA would object to abortions after 20 weeks but not before, is that correct?
That's the policy. I'll give you the link.
So the CMA does, oh, I have it in my book here, but the CMA does have a policy on discouraging patients to drink at all while they're pregnant. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm very much familiar with
So I'm wondering if that
Notice,
they only discourage their patients 20 weeks and beyond, or would they discourage their patients before 20 weeks?
They discourage all along, but that's for a different reason.
Why would they discourage all along
Because
if before 20 weeks it's not a human with human rights?
Because they look at the outcome, not at what's happening right now. They look at the outcome, and what they say is, if you're going to carry the fetus to term, the pregnancy to term, then you will do damage, and we as a society don't want that. Now, if you intend to have an abortion, go ahead and drink your brains out.
So you're saying that whether we protect the preborn child before 20 weeks from harm is dependent on what the parent plans to do with the duration of the pregnancy?
Absolutely.
So it sounds then that the value of the individual is not grounded in the individual, but the feelings of another individual towards them. Is that correct?
No, it has nothing to do with value. It has to do with putting into place a causal chain which predictably will result in harm, and you initiating that causal chain. If it was a different causal chain, if it was a causal chain that stopped with an abortion, you can do whatever you like.
Okay. Moving to the next question. Here in British Columbia, there's an abortionist who did an abortion on a woman who felt her pregnancy interfered with the trip that she had planned to Hawaii. Do you find that morally repugnant?
How old was the fetus?
Let's theorize then. If it was before 20 weeks, would you not find that morally repugnant?
There would be no violation of human rights.
Okay, so 19 weeks and 5 days.
Depends on the pregnancy. Now I have to add something here. It's not simply time. When you talk about a pregnancy as involving time, that's really a layperson's way of talking, because each fetus develops differentially in terms of both speed and type of organ development. So
just about time, in the interest of time, if we can get back to then, so you are a little uncomfortable at 19 weeks and 5 days?
No, you'll have to let me finish.
Not in the cross-exam part.
Well, I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and you're not letting me tell the whole truth. So the time frame is simply a lay person's talk about developmental stages. So when you say, am I uncomfortable with 19 and a half weeks, if by 19 and a half weeks you mean somebody who hasn't quite reached the 5-layer development of the human brain, the answer is, I have no problems there. If it has reached that, and it's earlier than 20 weeks, then I have problems with that.
Okay, so let's get back to this brain stuff then. In what human rights document does it say the basic right to life is grounded in your brain function?
Ah, I'm glad you asked that. I had a slide on that. You may recall the slide says the definition of member of the human family is somebody who has reason, understanding, and volition.
Actually, it says right here, all human beings are endowed with reason and conscience. Have you ever met a 1-year-old who has a functioning conscience?
I'm not talking about aborting a 1-year-old.
But what I'm curious about is if your definition is a current ability to have a functioning conscience, which you're arguing the embryo does not have, I'm making the point that a 1-year-old human also doesn't currently have a functioning conscience. Are you implying your interpretation of this document is that 1-year-olds, by virtue of not having a current conscience, are therefore not to be given human rights?
I'm not sure how familiar you are with 1-year-olds, but the ones I'm familiar with certainly are conscious. They don't have
a conscience. This is actually...
They don't have mind.
Oh, no, we'll go. I'll use it in my rebuttal. You get to ask me now. You get to interrupt me now, and this is the fun part. He didn't want to do this part.
I don't know what to ask her. Because, well, since it's mine, how many minutes have I got? I have 6, this is my 6 minutes I can waste on. I have no problem with saying that the fetus develops. I'd be a bigger idiot than I am if I had a problem with that. But I would point out to you that a zygote cannot have consciousness, cannot have awareness of any sort, at any level, because it hasn't got the physical wherewithal. And unless you're going to say that persons are not physical beings, but spiritual beings, in which case the debate is off, okay? Then you simply can't say these things about zygotes, you can't say these things about individuals who barely have a neural plate. So the definition of human rights does talk, as you yourself said, about conscience and reason. Now, the fact that somebody has conscience and reason doesn't mean they're exercising it right now. When I undergo a general anesthetic, I'm not conscious, I hope I'm not aware, okay, etc. But I don't have to undergo a change in order for that awareness to be there. So what am I asking you? I'm asking you is what you ground awareness and conscience, if not in neurological development.
So the very nature of the being is such that the individual has the ability to think and reason, but due to certain things like surgery, as you've mentioned, or age, as I'm going to expand upon in my rebuttal, the individual cannot act on the very human ability. The way a dog, by nature, barks. The way you and I are thinking beings, dogs are barking.
I can't interrupt you.
Yeah, you can go. Interrupt away.
Okay. You didn't answer my question.
Let's try.
The question was, what do you ground reason and awareness in, if not in the neurological development of the individual?
The individual herself, whether she has the ability, by virtue of her nature, to have these neurological capacities you speak of.
So, in other words, a totipotent stem cell has reason and awareness.
Are you talking about when one human twins and splits into another human?
No, I'm talking about a stem cell, totipotent, in other words, a zygote made up of these stem cells. It has reason and awareness?
The question is not, does someone currently have reason and awareness? The question is, put in a uterus, will they grow and mature to the stages of human development? If so, then the fact that they currently don't have reason and awareness is irrelevant. The fact that they have the nature to have those things is what matters. It's kind of like if we protect the sperm whale, which there's a whole movement to do because it has high brain function, we're not just going to protect the adult sperm whale, we're going to protect the fetal and the embryonic sperm whale as well. Because the very nature of that particular being is it has high functioning intellectually, but it can't act on it due to its age.
In other words, you're saying potentiality gives rights. I just went through that in terms of
not potential. There's a difference between someone being a potential human and someone being a human with great potential. So a 1-year-old is not a potential human, but a 1-year-old is a human with great potential. That 1-year-old is a potential 5-year-old, but she's still an actual human being. So the human embryo is not a potential human, but rather a human who will potentially be a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, and so on and so forth.
But it doesn't meet the definition of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It may.
Actually, how does it not? Because again, I've got it right here.
It has no reason and no conscience.
Okay, so again, we're back to the 1-year-old, and it's not consciousness. By the way, the word is conscience, and it finishes by saying, should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So the whole point here is that humans, by their nature, have a conscience and should act nicely to one another. But a 1-year-old doesn't get that the way we get that because of her lower brain development.
The Universal Declaration doesn't say, and those who can have that, but those who do. And that's why I looked at potentiality. What you have to come to grips with is, does being potentially X, in other words, somebody who potentially has certain characteristic, mean they have them right now?
So
if having the characteristics is necessary for the rights, then not having the characteristic means you don't have the rights.
Would you say there's a difference between inherent capacities and current capacities?
I went through 3 different notions of potentiality or capacity. So the answer is, of course there are differences.
So you would say human rights are grounded in your current capacities, not your inherent capacities.
That's correct.
And I'm saying that you, by virtue of being human, have the rights, and they're grounded in your inherent capacities, not your current capacities.
But
otherwise...
But that's what you're supposed to defend. You can't simply say that.
Say that again?
That's what you're supposed to establish, defend. You can't simply say that.
That's what all these documents do. They do not call them consciousness
They don't talk about
rights.
capacity. They don't talk about
They call
capacity.
them human rights. Who gets women's rights?
But you see, the notion of human has different meanings. That's why I went through that. You're switching from biological to legal and conceptual and Declaration of Human Rights meanings. And you can't do that.
So are you saying that the Declaration of Human Rights is grounded in a philosophical definition of human?
We're out of time there. Thank you too for the engaging dialogue there. We'll now have a chance for both of our speakers to do their rebuttal, and we'll start first with Stephanie.
Okay, so to jump right in where we just finished off there, Dr. Kluge is saying, and I'm going to quote exactly, Article 1 says that human beings are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Saying that we're endowed with reason and conscience is not anything I'm denying. My point is that the one-celled human embryo is endowed with reason and conscience the way an infant is endowed with reason and conscience, the way a one-year-old is endowed with reason and conscience. But if you spend time with infants and one-year-olds, you're going to see that currently they don't act very reasonable. And they don't seem to have much of a conscience when it comes to temper tantrums and stealing toys and other things like that. Would we say because the infant and the one-year-old currently do not exhibit high-level reasoning or a functioning conscience that we would deprive them of their human rights? No. We would say by virtue of being a member of the human family, which is what the UN document says, that they have the human right to live. And they are endowed with reason and conscience, but they can't act on it. Why can't they? Well, if you're sleeping, you're not acting, you're not using that consciousness, or conscience rather, that you have. When you're under anesthetic, you're not having rational thoughts the way you are in this debate. Does it mean that we may kill you when you're not currently exhibiting those abilities? No, we may not. So in the same way, we may not kill the embryo or the fetus when they currently aren't exhibiting those abilities, because we have to ask ourselves, why can't the embryo think or reason? Well, because the embryo, at least in the one-cell stage, does not have a brain. Why doesn't the embryo have a brain? Well, because the embryo hasn't developed a brain. Well, why hasn't the embryo developed a brain? Dr. Kluge went into great detail, but the point is the embryo merely hasn't had the time to develop the brain. And as I was alluding to in cross-examination, time is reflected in our age. Let's contrast a one-celled human embryo with an amoeba. Neither of those things can think or reason. But knowing why they can't think and reason will tell us why we protect one and not the other. The amoeba cannot think or reason because it doesn't have a brain. Well, why doesn't it have a brain? Well, it's never going to develop a brain because it's not within its nature. So the amoeba cannot think because it will never think because it's not a thinking thing. That's very different from why the one-celled human embryo cannot think. The one-celled human embryo cannot think ultimately because of how old she is. So one cannot think because of what it is, the other cannot think because of how old she is. So therefore, to deprive the human embryo of her right to live would be a human rights violation, discrimination based on age, which in section 15 of the Canadian Charter, it says you can't discriminate based on age. Now, the question is, are there other ways that humans can come to be beyond sexual reproduction? Yes, but what we have to ask ourselves is, can we say that if you come to be via sexual reproduction, that your beginning point is fertilization? Yes, I've gone through that. It's not disputed scientifically. And even Eike is alluding to that when he talks about things like 19 weeks and 20 weeks. That implies life begins at fertilization. You don't get to 20 weeks unless you started counting 20 weeks ago. We must think something significant happened 20 weeks before to press start on the stop clock. And so it's that moment that is the beginning of our lives. The question we have to ask ourselves is, right now, are we humans with human rights? If yes, we take the age we're at now, and we create a timeline in our mind working backwards to identify our beginning point. When we identify our beginning point, if we believe we're human, that we have human rights by virtue of being a member of the human family, then regardless of how developed we are on this timeline, regardless of how old we are on this timeline, we will have that basic right to live. And so that timeline takes us back to fertilization. So if it's wrong to kill us now, it's wrong to kill at fertilization. Dr. Kluge, or Eike as he wants to be called, is making the argument that it's only wrong to kill you based on how developed your brain is. Well, our brain is going to develop based on how old we are and what species we're in. Other species are going to have different degrees of brain development. Human rights are grounded in being human. If he wants to have neurological rights, fine, but be honest about that. That's not human rights. I think it's also important to look at the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It came into being in the late 1940s on the heels of the Holocaust, where humans were deprived of human rights based on a feature that people of the day thought was significant: ethnicity or religion. And if you fit in a certain camp, you were deprived of human rights. We threw that out and said, hey, that's bad. We should value you by virtue of being human. Because it wasn't just the Holocaust that reflected a denial of humans of their human rights, but even before that, here in Canada in the early 1900s, human rights were grounded in whether you were male or female, and if you had a certain sex, then you didn't have human rights. Or in the United States, your basic human rights were grounded in whether you were black or white, and if you were black, you didn't have those rights. So Dr. Eike is making the point that, it's not enough to be human. You need to be at a certain level of development. That is philosophically no different from someone who says, it's not enough to be human. You have to have a certain skin color. It's not enough to be human. You have to have a certain ethnicity. Not enough to be human. You have to be of a certain sex. Can we control our sex or our ethnicity? No. So why would it be fair to deprive someone of their basic right over a feature they can't control? Can you control your brain development? Can you control your age? Why would it be okay then to deprive someone of their basic rights over something they can't control, namely their brain development and their age? He speaks about people who have anencephaly, but he's talking as though they have no brain. Actually, there's a lower brain stem, there is some brain function, and there's a difference between brain death and brain damage. And brain death involves complete and irreversible cessation of the entire brain, including the brain stem. But there are people with brain damage who can continue to grow and develop and live and so forth. But even if we're to have some, debate about figuring out how we define death, this debate is when does life begin, not when does death happen. And so we're not talking about the embryo having a brain no more. We're talking about the embryo having a brain not yet. And there's an important difference between those two things. Is the brain not yet, or is the brain no more? Bear in mind, the brain isn't going to come to be without the body. The body is the necessary starting point. The brain is like the heart, the kidneys. These are parts of an individual. And the individual can exist without the part. And we know that because all of us were once embryos who didn't have a brain, and we're the same biological genetic individual that that embryo once was, which is proof that the body can grow and develop without the brain early in pregnancy. He spoke about potentials, and this is where he's confusing the issue. I am not saying the preborn child is a potential human. I am saying the preborn child is a human, the way an infant is a human, and a 5-year-old is a human, but just as the infant or the 5-year-old is a potential adult, the embryo is a potential adult. And if we were talking about adult rights, then the embryo doesn't get them. But we're not talking about adult rights, we're talking about human rights. If we go back to that Polaroid analogy, the image of the Loch Ness Monster at the brown, black, smudgy stage is not a potential picture. The picture is captured. It's a picture with great potential. But when you have the plain white card and you haven't yet taken a photo, you now have a potential photo. You have a potential image. But the moment you take the image, you now have an image with great potential. So the sperm and the egg are potential humans. I'm not trying to protect them. But when they come together, they form a human with great potential. He talked about the acorn as a potential oak. An acorn is a very immature oak, the way an infant is a very immature adult. But the acorn is of the oak family. Are we going to weep over someone squishing an acorn the way we might weep over someone cutting down an oak tree? No, because we value trees based on what they give us. Shade, beauty. So it's what they do that makes them valuable. We humans are very different, although tragically we're living in a world of use, where we like to use our fellow humans, which leads to human rights violations around the world. We value each other for our being, and in fact there's a Down syndrome advertisement awareness campaign which shows a picture of someone with Down syndrome with the caption, "Celebrate being." Celebrate being. We're not human doings, we're human beings. So we're valued for what we are, not what we do. That's very different from the oak tree analogy, and my time is up, so I'll finish in my closing remarks. Thank you.
How do you follow an act like that? Let me put something to you, Stephanie. You have a zygote that is endowed with all sorts of potentials, including that of having brown hair. Does the zygote have brown hair? I put it to you, no. It has the potential for having brown hair. I put it to you that a zygote, or an embryo, or even an early fetus, has all sorts of potentials. And as I pointed out to you before, being a potential X is not being an X. The issue is not whether the fetus or the embryo is biologically human. Biologically human, my dead relatives are human. Biologically dead bodies are human. Biologically wholly brain-dead individuals who are kept alive for 28 days are human. They are not persons. There's nobody home. And they have no rights because they do not meet the requirement of having now the capacity for sentient, cognitive, awareness, reason, conscience, whatever have you. What does that mean? Having the capacity doesn't mean that you exercise that capacity all the time. All of us have capacities. Some of us even have the capacity to fail our courses. And some of us will. That doesn't mean we haven't failed them yet. When I am unconscious, I still have the capacity, but if I am an anencephalic, to pick up the medical point, then in fact I have no capacity for awareness or conscience at all. I have at best a brainstem or the remnant of a brainstem, nothing else. And this is why there is considerable discussion on whether or not it would be useful to use anencephalics, it's going to horrify you, as experimental objects so that treatments for newborn babies can be developed. Because there's no moral issue there. They're not persons in the sense of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The issue about the acorn is a fetal oak, not an oak. It's not even a miniature oak. It hasn't got any roots for starters, but never mind, let's not go there. Okay? And again, the point is, the fact that somebody is a potential X doesn't mean they're going to be an X. One has to keep in mind that if we agree that every zygote is a human being with human rights, then theoretically we have a serious, or you have a serious problem. The data are incontrovertible that between 40 and 50% of all pregnancies are aborted before the woman ever knows she's pregnant. Should we then hold a funeral every time a woman has a period? After all, if it's a person, if it's a human being, we bury them in a funeral. That is to show respect and they have rights. Now, maybe that's irrelevant, but really that does follow, doesn't it? What do we do also when somebody says, and I keep coming back to the potential, I'm a potential Nobel Prize winner, I have the endowment, but I never exercise it because I'm lazy. Yes, there will be a matter of time, but it's not time that's important. It's what time allows to occur. And when what can occur doesn't occur, then when it didn't occur, I'm not the same thing as I was before. Or, pardon me, I'm not the same thing as I would have been if it had occurred. That's what I wanted to say, sorry. So, the notion of potentiality is absolutely crucial. And I suggest to you, Ms. Gray, if you're going to call me Dr. Kluge, I'm going to call you Ms. Gray. I suggest to you that, in fact, you might seriously want to reconsider why, in the history of this debate, and this debate goes back for over 600 years, somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas would come along and say, a fetus, before it has reached the development of a brain, cannot have a soul, and cannot be a human being in a relevant sense. Now, he put it very badly, and I'm sorry to teach you guys some history. He put it very badly by saying the fetus changes species as it changes. I don't want to put it that way, but I'm pointing out to you that there has been agreement all along that fundamental changes occur, and a fundamental change that changes the constitution of the individual makes that a different individual. The fact that the potential was there all along doesn't mean anything except, well, if it could have gone on, it would have been something else. But it isn't that something else now. Right now, it is simply DNA looking for a way to grow and make more DNA. Right now, it's simply the whole human genetic code, which has all of these wonderful potentials, waiting to be actualized. And waiting to be actualized doesn't mean it now has all these rights, because they're not actualized. I don't know what else I can say to that. It's simply a matter of logic. It has nothing to do with time. Time is simply what is needed in order to reach the stage where you can, in fact, be a person, where you can, in fact, be someone who has conscience, awareness, volition, whatever you like. If you don't have that grounding, if it isn't there, then you don't have those. I don't know what else to say. I'd simply be repeating myself. I have 3 minutes. I'll stop. Thank you, Stephanie.
I've just been informed to just let you all know we each have 9 minutes of closing, and then it goes to Q&A. So several things I'd like to say in response to Dr. Kluge. The first is just to make a clarification of one of the questions he asked me during cross-examination about a totipotent cell, and I need to quickly check because I didn't want to confuse pluripotent from totipotent. So yes, a totipotent cell is a human being. So yes, I would protect the totipotent cell, because what we have to ask ourselves is, if the totipotent cell is in the right environment, will that individual grow to adulthood? Yes. If a skin cell is in the uterus, will the skin cell grow to adulthood? No. The skin cell is a part of a human. That's different from a whole human. So again, going back to the Polaroid analogy, when you take the picture, we shake it, but we actually don't have to. If we put the image down, and we step back, and we do nothing to it, it's in the right environment, but we do nothing to it, and we watch, will the Polaroid develop to show us Nessie? Will it do that? Yes. It has everything it needs within it, it just needs time to develop. So a totipotent cell is like that. You step back, if it's in the right environment the way the Polaroid is, and she's going to grow to mature adulthood. That's not the same as other kinds of cells, which would be like a skin cell. You put a skin cell in the uterus, you don't do anything to it like we would with cloning. So we haven't taken the DNA out and put it in a nucleated egg. We just take the skin cell, put it in the uterus, step back, nothing's going to happen. And so the question is, what is the embryo like? Is the embryo like the skin cell or like the totipotent cell? The embryo is a whole human. He brings up Thomas Aquinas, so I think it's just very important to make the point that Thomas Aquinas was talking about ensoulment. So that's really not a scientific issue, that's a religious, metaphysical question, which isn't what this debate is about. But even with regards to that, his lines were 40 days and 80 days, so we're talking about very early. But besides that, the point is he still said abortion is a violation of natural law and always wrong. So he was really just trying to figure out, well, when does the body get a soul? But regardless of it not having a soul, it's still wrong to kill it. So that, I just think it's important to address because he was kind of misleading you as to Aquinas's position on that. The other thing is, when he speaks about, saying, would we have, he's talking about the implications that will come from identifying that the embryo is a human with human rights. And he talked about, would we have funerals for periods? Well, a period does not indicate a miscarriage. That's actually something that normally happens every month for a woman. But if she's had a pregnancy test and then she starts to bleed and therefore learns that this is a miscarriage, then absolutely, no matter how early it is in that pregnancy, I would collect the blood and I would bury it. Because within that is the disintegrated, tiny, not visible to the naked eye, body of a human being. And I have relatives who have done that very thing. The other thing that we need to consider is he brings up personhood, which I'm glad he did, because really that's what's at the heart of the issue here. And it's kind of misleading because personhood is not what is referenced in all of these human rights documents. It's being human, not being a person. And the reason for that, as I said, the history of the human rights document is that humans were deprived of personhood status. And the UN said, hey, that's wrong. It's not whether you're a person, it's whether you're a human. Because a human is what you are biologically, and a person is what those in power say whether you have rights or not. And that has resulted in human rights violations. What's interesting, and actually Eike had it up there, but he didn't draw attention to it, Article 6 of the UN's document says, everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. They say, if you're human, you are a person. The UN is saying this. And proof of that is they have adopted a document called the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that speaks about the behavior of countries which allow the death penalty and rules regarding that. And they say in countries where the death penalty happens, it may never be performed on a pregnant woman. Interesting. The UN is making so many references to acknowledging the child is alive before birth. What is the difference between a guilty... Oh, okay, we're going to pause the clock because Eike's gone out. So what is the difference between a guilty pregnant woman and a guilty non-pregnant woman? They're acknowledging that within the body of one of those guilty parties is the presence of an innocent party. So I don't bring that up to create a debate about whether we support or reject the death penalty. I bring it up to say, hey, regardless of what we think about the death penalty, there's something both sides of the death penalty debate agree on. No one who's innocent gets the death penalty. Both sides can agree on that. And so by the UN adopting this document and saying, hey, you can't do the death penalty on pregnant women, is this acknowledgement that within her body is the presence of an innocent child. A child who should be considered a person everywhere before the law, by their own words. So again, all he keeps coming back to is the fact that humans are endowed with reason and conscience. I agree, and I'm simply saying the embryo, the fetus, the infant, the toddler, the teenager, and the adult are all endowed with reason and conscience. But they can't always act currently on the things they're endowed with. Some humans can't act on those things because of their environment or their state, such as being in surgery. Other humans can't act on this reason and conscience because of their age. The UN is saying all of that is irrelevant if you're a member of the human family, and that I have proven biologically, you have the right to life. Eike wants to say it's not about your biology, it's about philosophically or legally whether we consider you a person. And the UN says, right, that's what people in the past did. They said it's not about your biology, it's about a feature I happen to pick that I have and you don't, and that's why you're not a person. So Eike is picking a feature that he happens to have, which is higher brain development, that he only has because he's lived long enough to have that brain development. When he talked about we have to consider the implications of considering the embryo a human, I think really that's ultimately at the heart of the debate. And the issue is not so much us not knowing whether we should protect the embryo, but us not wanting to protect the embryo. Because if the embryo is a human with human rights, then we're all going to have to come to terms with the fact that we have violated some human rights, that we have deprived the youngest amongst us of their right to live. And that's not in any way meant to minimize the very serious circumstances a woman in crisis may find herself in. Maybe she's pregnant from sexual assault. Maybe she's pregnant and very poor. Maybe she's pregnant in an abusive relationship and has no support. Those are very serious crises, and we need to help women in those crises. What I'm asking us to consider is it fair to end the life of one human when the life of another human is very difficult? It doesn't mean it's going to be easy to live that out, but the point is not what's easy, the point is what's right. And across the board, we see in human rights doctrines the acknowledgement that humans have the right to live. Eike talked about security of person, but my right to do with my body what I want stops when I hurt someone else. I can stand here all evening and debate with my arms swinging. It's my right to do my body what I want. It's my security of person. But if I'm going to swing my arm to the point of hitting someone in the nose, we're suddenly going to say, hey, you can't argue that you're allowed to do that because it's your security of person. Because what I'm doing with my person is suddenly hurting another person. That's not acceptable. So that's why in order to determine whether a woman's quote-unquote right to abortion is protected by security of person boils down to whether it's just her body or whether it's someone else's body. And we've seen the visual evidence that there's another body there. That wasn't the woman's little leg, her little arm, the little head. That was the head, the torso, the arms and legs of another human being that the UN says has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. That is why abortion is a human rights violation. Thank you.
Let me take you back to something I said in the beginning. One of my slides. Let's grant Stephanie everything she wants. That a fertilized ovum is a human being in her full-blooded sense. Not simply biologically, but also, I don't use the word philosophically, I'm not a philosopher, I do medical ethics. A human being in the full-blooded sense that you want and has all the rights. That doesn't make abortion a violation of human rights. Why not? Well, it all depends. Because you have, let's give you what you want. Let's give you that the fetus, the zygote, the embryo, is a human being just as much as the pregnant woman. Okay? Then we have two human beings. I know you don't like person, I'll talk about that in a minute. And we have two human beings. The fact that we have two human beings doesn't tell us whose rights should take priority. You have to look and see. You have to balance. And sometimes, and when you balance competing rights, both of which cannot be maintained at the same time, somebody's going to lose. That's the problem with balancing. So, you need an independent argument to show that the one human being's rights take priority over the other person's right. That was your task, Stephanie. And with respect, I don't think you've done it. You've simply said, abortion is killing of a human being, therefore it's a violation of rights. Whoa, 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 whoa. Isn't that what you're supposed to prove? After all, the woman as a human being also has rights. So I await with bated breath an argument to show me why the woman's right, which is the same as the fetus's right, loses. That's one part. The other part I wanted to say is to pick up on something you said about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and laws and capital punishment and all that jazz. Speaking with some familiarity about how laws are made, I'm the person who's responsible why there's no abortion law in Canada. I was intimately involved in that in the Senate. Speaking with some familiarity of how this works, I can tell you that laws are political artifacts. They're made by people whose sole qualification for making laws is that they've won a popularity contest. And some of the laws they make are weird and wonderful. Some are good. So one cannot simply point to laws in many countries that say you may not execute a pregnant woman and say, therefore that shows that fetuses are human beings in your sense. All it shows is that a duly constituted authority in a particular country has made that choice. That makes it neither right nor wrong. That simply means that's the law. And as some of you may know, the law can be dead wrong. You want an example? I'll give you an example. It was the law until 1972 that in Alberta and BC, mentally disabled women could be sterilized non-consensually. That law was bad. But it was the law. So if you want to pinpoint the law and say something is right, then I'm afraid we're going to have another entirely different debate. As to Aquinas, it wasn't a matter of religion. I don't carry much truck for Aquinas. My favorite medieval thinker is not Aquinas, but John Duns Scotus. Different story. That's a matter of history. The reason why I refer to Aquinas' position is, first of all, he said, and I quote, from the third book of commentaries on the 4 books of sentences of the Master Peter Lombard, which unless you have read Latin, you will not have read because it's never been translated. I went and checked the original. Okay? He says, on this matter I agree with St. Augustine that abortion before that time should be punished by a money fine, not a soul taken for a soul. Never mind soul, life for life. What is a money fine? It's a fine for property. The fetus before that time was considered property. Not mommy's property, by the way, daddy's property, but that's another issue again. Okay? So why did I focus on Aquinas? Well, because he pointed out something very important. What he pointed out, and he was following a tradition which was followed until even now, is that unless you have a certain capacity here and now, you cannot have rights. You may disagree with all of these people on animal rights. They also thought that animals are just biological organisms and, machines. But that's another issue. The issue is, if you do not meet certain criteria, you cannot have rights. And interestingly enough, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says you must have reason and conscience. Not the potential for reason and conscience. That was entirely open for them to do that. Not the capacity for reason and conscience, but have that. And if you don't have it, you don't count. Not in the terms of rights. that doesn't mean no respect. Right is different from respect. One should never kill just for the heck of it. Ever. One should show respect, certainly for life. But that doesn't mean the same kind of respect is due to someone that is merely potential as respect is due to something that is actual and has a certain characteristic. So, as to the period, the reason I mentioned that is, I found it very interesting. You said you would hold a funeral if you'd had a pregnancy test and found out you were pregnant and then had a period. Notice what I said. The data show 40 to 50% before she ever knows she's pregnant. Not that she's had a test. She simply has a period. And you never know, with all respect, Stephanie, well, I don't know anything about your sexual habits, but a woman never knows if she's had unprotected intercourse, whether in fact she's pregnant. Naturally, that may be the case. That's why, as a matter of respect and prophylaxis, you should hold a funeral. I get back to balancing. It's not the issue of who is biologically human and who has potential. It's the issue of whether you're human in a rights sense and have that capacity here and now. If not, then I'm terribly sorry, but you don't have those rights that I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers and to all of you for your patience, for your respect. You probably weren't expecting to be here for over 2 hours and to go through what you had to go through a little while ago. But now it's your chance to ask our speakers some questions.
Okay, so my question goes to your argument of potentiality. As a Catholic, I'm sure you recognize that the Catholic doctrine says 2 things about atheists. It says, number 1, if they die, they should burn in hell. And number 2, they are potential Catholics. So my question to you is, how is that different?
I would have some comments about your theology, but in the interest of the debate not being about religion, I'm just going to leave that for Q&A at the end, one-on-one. In terms of potentiality, I'm not saying the preborn child is a potential human. So actually, Eike and I have wonderful conversations together. We had coffee last time, we didn't have time to have it now. But I have to say, he keeps misrepresenting and being intellectually dishonest by very soothingly talking about potentiality and misrepresenting my claims. So I'm not saying that the embryo is a potential human. What I'm saying is the embryo doesn't have a functioning brain yet at the 1-cell stage, the way a 1-year-old doesn't have functioning sexual organs at that age. My point simply is I'm consistent with human rights doctrines around the world that says your rights are grounded in existing. He's saying your rights are grounded in a certain level of development, which is arbitrary and dehumanizing, the way it would be arbitrary and dehumanizing to say your rights are grounded in having achieved the level of puberty, which is just another developmental level. So I'm not making any potential claim that the embryo is a potential human. The embryo is not yet an adult the way a 5-year-old isn't an adult, and a 5-year-old's brain is not as developed as an adult's brain. But they're all actual humans, not potential humans. So I'm confused why potentiality keeps coming up, because it's not at all a claim I'm making.
I reply that you're confusing timeline with actual nature of the individual as the individual is here and now. If in fact I ever came across a zygote that had reason and conscience, I would certainly give it human rights. No question about it. But our other suspect I won't. And that's something that you have to address.
questions for Stephanie. You made I have to agree with Dr. Kluge's statement that you haven't made the case that if the zygote is a human, that its rights necessarily trump that of the woman's. Many women experience detriments in pregnancy, such as sickness, can experience some life-threatening complications, that sort of thing. In that sense, isn't it the fetus's exercising its rights up to the point of harming the woman? What gives the fetus the right to inflict harm on the woman when the woman cannot inflict harm on the fetus, as you're arguing?
Great question. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to address that point. When you have a rights conflict, so you have two humans, the embryonic human and the adult female human, we have to ask ourselves, well, what right is the most foundational? And the right to life is more foundational than, say, the right to liberty, because if I have no life with which to exercise a liberty right. So the most foundational is the right to life. And so in that situation, we have to ask ourselves, okay, the woman is a right to life and the embryo is a right to life. Let's set aside for a moment the issue of her life being in danger and talk about a pregnancy in which that isn't the case. Then it comes down to, well, is there anywhere else the embryo should be? And the answer is no. The embryo actually is where the embryo should be. And therefore, do parents have a responsibility to meet the basic needs of their children? And if the answer is yes, then just as we would expect parents to feed, clothe, and shelter their born children, and if they don't do those things or inflict direct harm, there would be legal consequences, correspondingly, parents should have to feed, clothe, and shelter their preborn children, and if they directly harm the child and not provide those things, there should be consequences as there would be with born children, if they're both human. Now, in terms of the woman's life being in danger, what we have to ask ourselves is, well, what is the condition? Why is her life in danger? If she has cancer, for example, let's say she has even uterine cancer, removing the baby is not going to get the cancer out. What needs to be taken out is the uterus. And so I would absolutely support intervening on medical conditions that address the medical condition and that don't involve direct killing. And there are ways to do that. So you may have to remove the uterus, you may have to administer chemotherapy. In a case of an ectopic pregnancy, you may need to do a salpingectomy, which isn't an abortion, it's a removal of the fallopian tube. And I would say all those things are ethical because they're actually targeting the woman's body and the pathology within her body, which is fundamentally different from abortion, which targets the baby's body and then eliminates the baby. Thank you.
Oh, I get it. The issue still remains, and I'm glad you agree that it becomes a balancing of rights to life. And oh, by the way, doing a salpingectomy or radical hysterectomy of the uterus is going to kill the fetus. No question about it. So you still have to come back to the question whether or not simply being a member of the species Homo sapiens in a biological sense is what grants rights. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't say that. That's why we have the courts, both of us. So you may want to revisit that. I'm not
I just want to address a point that Stephanie made. I think it's pretty compelling, but just more directly, the point that it seems that on your position you're committed to something like anybody who doesn't have reason doesn't have rights. So someone with mental illness or a 5-year-old even. I just would like to give you the opportunity to address that more directly.
Wonderful question, if I may paraphrase Stephanie. Did I say anything about the level of reason? Or sophistication? I don't recall. I have also, but I don't recall.
It's degree.
It's whether or not there is any conscience, awareness, reason. So if you're like me, are educated to the target, you still, oh, by the way, that's certified. I still have rights, so does the individual who suffers from a very severe case of trisomy 21. I said nothing about that. My position doesn't entail that at all. So the issue of discrimination against the mentally disabled does not apply at all.
So I appreciate the questioner's use of the term difference in degree versus difference in kind, which is bang on what we're really debating here. The preborn child and the born child differ in degree but not in kind. One is smaller, one is larger, so on and so forth, but they're the same species. The 5-year-old and the adult differs in degree, size, development, etc., but they're the same kind of being. So all of these documents, to not sound like a broken record, say it's your kind, not your degree. And again, I'm the one with the document here, not just the quote, so you can come and look at it afterwards, but Eike is misrepresenting Article 1. It says, all humans are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. By the way, look at the images I showed. Is that acting towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood? Question number 1. But question number 2 is, it's not saying that's why it's wrong to kill them. It's just stating a descriptive fact about humans, that we are endowed with reason and conscience. And by the way, I'm agreeing with that, and the embryo is endowed with reason and conscience. So the very thing he's using to defend his point refutes his point.
My question is, had we had my wife's eggs harvested at that time, because at that point we were already using all the resources that we had to raise other people's children. So if we wanted to have our own, we could have harvested the eggs. They could have been fertilized, and you know, they're in my freezer now. Okay? So normally in fertility clinics, they fertilize more than one egg, several of them. Now I'm getting older. If I can't afford to pay my hydro bill, am I violating the human rights that are in my freezer?
Great question, and a very timely one in our world in which hundreds of thousands of human beings are currently in a freezer. And I actually think that the reproductive technology industry has helped the abortion debate, and here's why. In the abortion debate, we often hear people saying, well, we just don't know when life begins. Well, let's not talk about when we want to end life. Let's talk about when we want to make life. And the reproductive technology industry has consistency across the board. The scientists know exactly when life begins. It's the moment they're trying to replicate in the lab. You ship a sperm sample off to that lab, to the IVF specialist, they're not going to be satisfied with just the sperm sample. They're not going to be satisfied with just the egg sample. What is the one moment those who want to create life are aiming to replicate? Is it the 20-week mark? Do they suddenly get a 20-week fetus? Is it the 6-month mark? Is it the 6-week mark? The one moment where they're like, bingo, we have success, is sperm-egg fusion. It's the moment of fertilization. That's why it is a problem for reproductive technology organization if the power goes out, because their clients know that their children are currently frozen. So if the power goes out, they're going to lose, quote unquote, their investment. So yes, we do have humans in freezers. This is a problem because it is depriving them of their right to grow and develop. They're not dead because if they get implanted, they can grow to birth. So living things can't come from dead things, so they had to have been alive. We have this crazy situation where we have humans in a suspended state where they're not dead, but they're not being allowed to grow and develop at the rate a human normally would if they were in a non-kind of freezing environment. So yes, these are humans deserving of human rights, currently being deprived of their human rights, and that's a serious violation.
They're biologically human. You're back to the biological versus other of human being. Again, I point out to you that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, members of the human family endowed with reason and conscience, and not potentially happy, but endowed with having a human family. The freezer full of zygotes doesn't fall into that category with respect.
I'm sorry if this question has been asked before, but my question is that it's kind of a psychological fact that 1-year-olds do not have kind of a self-consciousness. They're kind of halfway aware that the world is out there, but they're not sure what everything is yet. So I suppose my question is how do you define consciousness in the sense of being able to reason with that consciousness as well?
One distinguishes between different levels of reasoning and different complexity of consciousness. The complexity of consciousness of a human is very, very low, when in fact it has not only a reactivity, but a rather more sophisticated type of reactivity in terms of a low level of consciousness than somebody at 12 weeks, because that complexity isn't there. That complexity will increase as the newborn baby grows. But the degree of complexity makes all the difference in the world. As anyone who's ever opened a box of Legos knows, the potential, the capacity for building a Lego space station is there. But you haven't got a Lego space station. There's a fundamental difference. The complexity makes all the difference in how you develop that. And that makes the difference also from a fetus, a 1-year-old, and a 25-year-old.
And whether one human has achieved that complexity currently or not is entirely dependent on how much time has passed by and how old they are. So it comes back to a Section 15 charter violation, which says you can't discriminate based on age. I'd like to bring up a point that Eike mentioned, in which he talked about the scandal of how in Alberta up until 1970s, women who were mentally disabled were sterilized without their consent, and he was horrified. Yet the people who made that decision had a criteria of what humans have certain rights and what ones don't. And it wasn't grounded in your biological identity as a human. It was grounded in your mental capacities. What he's doing is changing the degree that matters to him. He's saying, well, it's not that much of a mental capacity. It's a certain physical, neurological, structural point that you get at 20 weeks. But philosophically, it's the same claim as the people who are discriminating in Alberta. He's picking something that's arbitrary, that's grounded in your development or your disability, and isn't what human rights are about.
I just want to start by thanking both of you for your patience with everything that happened earlier. You keep mentioning that you're not talking about potentiality, but you use phrases like age, they're just not old enough yet, or they're not developed enough yet. And I'm wondering, how do you differentiate that? How do you say that, you know, there's this timeline, but progressing along that timeline is not potentiality? I think that there's a problem with coming to terms here, because Eike keeps mentioning it, and then you keep saying that you're not saying it, but then you word it in other ways. But I think you are speaking about potentiality, and I'm just wondering how you reconcile that.
Okay, so a potentiality argument would say it's wrong to kill the embryo because the embryo will think. I'm not making that claim. I'm saying it's wrong to kill the embryo because the embryo is human. Not what the embryo will be, but what the embryo is. And so when he's saying it's wrong to kill you when, not you are a human, but it's wrong to kill you when you have a certain neurological developmental stage, when you've hit that. And then my response is, but then how do you respond to the person who says 19 weeks instead of 20, 21 weeks instead of 20, the women in Alberta? So I'm not saying it's wrong to kill the embryo because the embryo will think. I'm saying it's wrong to kill the embryo because the embryo is human, and this isn't just Stephanie's opinion. This is what the UN is saying, it's what our charter says, it's what the Universal Declaration of the Rights of the Child says. If you were a member of the human family, otherwise these would be called neurological rights. And if you want to be a proponent of neurological rights, fine, but just be honest about it and don't say it's about human rights, it's about neurological rights. There are some rights I don't think we should get by virtue of being human. Voting rights, for example. I think you need to be human plus a certain age. The right to drive. I think you need to be human plus a certain age. So there are certain rights, civil rights, that we will get by virtue of something that we can do, a current capacity. But then there are other rights that are grounded not in what I can currently do, but what I am. And that's the point that I'm simply making.
Thank you, Stephanie. What I hear you to say is, I, Stephanie, am saying that because I'm a member of the species Homo sapiens, I have all of these rights. That's precisely what's at issue. You can't simply say that. You have to establish that. So I think we have failed in our debate. Not you have failed, we have failed to communicate. Because I distinguished several meanings of the word human being, even in the sense of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I guess we can have to cross the monologues.
One thing that sort of piqued my curiosity was earlier, both of you sort of mentioned this issue of executing a pregnant woman. And one of the things that you brought up was the idea of, those specific laws being made by duly constituted authorities. And so my question is sort of, how do you differentiate between those sort of domestic authorities that are making those laws for a country and the UN, who's making these charter rights? Is there really a difference between those, and where do you sort of ground the difference?
Nice question, to which I have no answer except to say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a political statement made by a group of individuals who got together in a certain location, and in fact it hasn't been adopted by law in all countries, and it isn't law. If it were law, my same reply would be we would have to look at what they're saying, why they're saying it. Is it maybe a legal thing, or does it in fact reflect something ethical? And if you're dealing with an ethical issue, then with all respect, you have to look at what a right is. Now here I'll put on my very badly fitting philosopher's hat, namely, a right is some justified claim that you may exercise if you wish, but you don't have to. Therefore, you don't have the capacity for having understanding and volition, then you can't have rights. That's why a Zygote has no rights.
And that very definition would deprive a newborn infant of rights. So again, it comes down to whether we protect the individual by virtue of the nature or by virtue of the ability. Some rights are by virtue of ability, but other rights are by virtue of nature. I think when Eike said, when it comes to declarations and statements which, aren't law, for example, we have to ask ourselves, well, what are they and why did they come to be? And I think that touches on what I said for this document being embraced in the years, in the late 1940s. Why did it come to be? Because humans were being deprived of human rights. Because some humans were saying other humans can be killed because they're different. And that's ultimately what is being said tonight. As much as Eike just said, oh, maybe we're not communicating well. No, I think we're communicating very well. There's just two extremely different worldviews. One says, hey, we're all equal, and if you're a member of the human family, you have a right to live. The other view says, if you're a member of the human family but you don't meet my criteria, I can kill you.
Well, first of all, again, thank you both for participating in what has been, I think, beneficial intellectual discourse this evening. My question is for you, Stephanie, because you've spoken greatly about the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and in particular, you've mentioned Article 1 on several occasions. Article 1 reads, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. My question for you there is with the usage of the word born. Would you think, or do you think that suggests that the United Nations chose the word born so as to suggest some point later than the moment of conception?
Great question. I think we need to look at, first of all, when this was adopted in the late 1940s, in which abortion was rejected by society. So the inclusion of the word born in our present day may be perceived as, ooh, look, they're talking about life at birth. But in the context of the day, that was a society that rejected the killing of the preborn. The second thing is, saying all human beings are born free and equal doesn't mean that if you're not born, you aren't equal or that you don't have dignity. I could say, for example, all 2-year-olds are free and equal in dignity. It doesn't mean 1-year-olds aren't. So it's important that we be able to acknowledge making a claim such as that doesn't mean those who aren't yet born wouldn't be. There's no saying of that. And then the other thing is, its reference to all members of the human family is what would protect the preborn if they are members of the human family. So if we can prove, as I have scientifically, that they're members of the human family, then that in that preamble where it says the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So all I need to do is prove that the preborn are members of the human family, and that talk of them having inherent dignity, inalienable rights applies to them. But great question.
With all respect, preborns aren't born. First of all. Secondly, just a matter of historical accuracy, abortion wasn't condemned. Abortion was condemned under certain circumstances and a certain criteria. And that was the law in all countries, including Canada. So if one gives a modicum of intelligence to the drafters of the Universal Declaration, they could easily have said, all biological human beings are. Is that all human beings that are born? So the point of the question still remains.
Okay, the point of the question still remains. Does it remain? Well, thank you all for coming. You have hopefully all received a survey. And if you did not receive a survey when you came in, if you can maybe just raise your hand, and we'll just have some club members give those to you. We'd appreciate it if you took a minute or two to fill it out before you leave, and just give it to one of the club members who will be at the doors on your way out. And just before you leave, I'd like to invite the presidents of the club that hosted the event just to come up for a few words.
Hi everyone, I'm Kimberly, and I am co-president of Youth Protecting Youth.
And I'm Adrian, and I'm also a co-president.
First of all, we want to thank you so much for coming out today, making this event a huge success, and listening respectfully to the debate. We want to let you know that next Thursday, we're having a roundtable discussion on the topic. At the exit doors at the top there, they'll have more information on this. And yeah, I think it's a really great way for us to get together and talk intellectually as students about the issue. Finally, we want to say thank you so much to our debaters, to Stephanie and Eike, for coming and sharing their thoughts and opinions with us. And also thank you to Anastasia for doing such a great job moderating today.
And so our two speakers will be here for a little bit longer if you want to talk to them. I encourage you to continue the discussion amongst your friends and with your class, and enjoy the rest of your evening.